Um, Thank you for coming to Protecting Our Communities and World on Fire. My name's Andrew Gage. I'm a staff lawyer with West Coast Environmental Law and part of the Secretariat for the Sue Big Oil campaign. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the West Coast Environmental Law's offices are located on the territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam nations, and that all of us joining today are joining from lands that have been cared for and managed from time immemorial by Indigenous nations, all of whom have their own approaches and experiences with fire. As of this morning, in what's now known as the province of British Columbia, there are 167 active wildfires, 63 of them out of control. 1,646 firefighters are struggling to deal with these fires, and they've put out over 1,000 fires so far this season. But 471,769 hectares have been burned. In terms of the area burnt, this year isn't nearly as bad, at least in this province, as several recent years. But despite that, we're seeing again just how aggressive wildfires can be in this warming world and how our communities are not ready, as we've seen from the evacuations in Summerland, Peachland, and Vernon so far this year. The causes are complicated, but looming over everything is the fact that our planet is warming due to a heat-trapping blanket of fossil fuel pollution and other greenhouse gases. Before I turn things over to our three great panelists to talk about what's needed to keep our communities safe, I'd like to invite you to fill out a poll telling us how wildfires are affecting your lives and the lives of close family and friends. You can select as many answers as apply to you. Audio is echoing. Could any of the panelists who aren't currently, looks like we're all muted. On a logistical note, while you're filling out that survey, I'd like to note that at any time during today's webinar, you can type questions that you have for our panelists into the Q&A feature. You should then be able to see the questions that others have asked and click on them to upvote them, indicating that you'd like to see them answered. In a moment, I'll turn the mic over to John Vaillant, author of Fire Weather. He'll be followed by Kelsey Winter, the executive director of the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Center. And our final panelist will be Dr. Carly Phillips of the Union of Concerned Scientists. Each panelist will introduce themselves in more detail. Before we go there, Ben, can you share the results of the poll? I realize it hasn't been very long, but hopefully we've got some results. And we can really see that although some of us are affected more than others, pretty much all of us are living in some way with wildfires and their impacts. And so with that, I'd like to invite John to take it away.
Hi, everybody. So good to be with you, if only virtually, but we've, by not all merging on one place to be together, we've um, preserved an extraordinary amount of CO2. And if you were to count all the fires that would have been combusted in the combustion chambers of our respective cars or jets, they would have numbered in the millions to get us all together. So glad to be with you in this format, and I'm going to be sharing some slides and just talking about my approach to this, which is as a citizen and a journalist. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a climate person. I'm not a firefighter. I came upon this story back in 2016 um, in the form of fire weather. And uh, there we go. I hope everybody can see the slides. If someone could give me a high sign, maybe. Right on. Okay. So Fort McMurray was overrun by fire. The petroleum hub of Canada, really, and certainly of Alberta, was overrun by fire in 2016. It was a terrifying situation, and it drove what was then the largest evacuation due to wildfire in modern times. And if you've been to Fort McMurray, it's a very can-do place. There's a lot of competence there, an enormous amount of capable infrastructure and extraordinary amount of heavy machinery. And all the citizens were driven from that town in a single afternoon. None of the incredible machinery they could have brought to bear had any effect on the firestorm and its magnitude. And it produced a notable pyrocumulonimbus fire cloud, also known as a pyro CB. I'm going to be talking about those today too. And what was clear to me, and what was why it was clear to me, is because it was clear to Stephen J. Pine, who's kind of the eminence grise of wildfire. He's an American professor and former firefighter who's written literally a bookshelf's worth of books about fire, fire history, fire culture, fire behavior, and a brilliant guy. And he wrote a piece for Slate in 2016 that basically, after the Fort McMurray fire, saying, "We've entered the Pyrocene age. We've entered the age of fire." And I took that to heart and I wrote this book accordingly. And the things that I describe in fire weather are now coming to pass across our entire hemisphere. This is an extraordinary summer, I think probably unparalleled in human history in terms of extraordinarily powerful, intense, fast-moving fires burning literally from the Pacific coast to Siberia. There's a third of a million people displaced right now just in France and Spain. There are fires in Westphalia, Germany, that can't be fought because they're occurring in a forest that is filled with unexploded World War II ordnance. So things are blowing up in there. You can't go in there. Likewise, in Ukraine, attacks by Russia are multiplying into wildfires because it's so hot and dry there. And so this brings us to this uh, term that all of us are living in, whether we know it or not, and that is we're in the Pyrocene age, but also in an age of discontinuity. Alex Steffen is a very uh, excellent, thoughtful, worth your time futurist based out of Berkeley, California. And he describes discontinuity as an event or situation wherein past experience ceases to be a useful guide in future problem solving. And current wildfires are a perfect example of that. They do not respond to water bombers, they do not respond to ground forces. They are so big and so powerful that all you can do is what folks in Fort McMurray had to do, and that is run away. And so, what first responders are charged with now, rather than fighting fire, is trying to engineer the safest evacuations possible. And there are massive fires burning right now outside of Reno, Nevada, massive fires right now burning outside of Fort Worth, Texas. Spokane, Washington, second biggest city in Washington, just got absolutely hammered. 1,000 structures burned, tens of thousands of people evacuated. Of course, Summerland is far from resolved in BC, and there are more fires on the way. We had 11,000 lightning strikes over the weekend, so we are deep in it, and that's to say nothing of what's going on in Turkey or Serbia or Algeria, where fires are also raging. And that's just, there are dozens of countries now. There have been, I think, 1,100 wildfires in the UK. They're declaring it their worst summer for this kind of thing in history. So this is what people are going through all over the Northern Hemisphere right now. These are the types of evacuation scenarios that people are having to endure. These are ordinary people just like us. We're not psychologically prepared for this or physically prepared for it. This was taken by uh, a an escapee from the Beacon Hill neighborhood in Fort McMurray in 2016, and he's stuck in traffic. He is not moving right now. The cars in front of him belong to his wife and daughter, and he's sitting there in his truck watching fireballs roll over his daughter and his wife, and he's completely helpless. And the disempowerment, along with the terror, along with the physical danger, really can't be underestimated. And one of the signal features of 21st century fire, which is what I call it, these new, faster, bigger, hotter, harder to subdue blazes, are pyro-CBs or pyrocumulonimbus fire clouds. And they are these large stratosphere puncturing weather systems that now are emerging on a regular basis out of wildfires, They started in Australia and California. We've had a bunch of them now in BC, record numbers. In fact, the 2023 season, Canada's worst fire season, our Black Summer, if you will, generated 142 Pyro CB events. Pyro CB events can generate enough smoke individually to shroud a nation the size of Tunisia or a state the size of Georgia. They are basically self-perpetuation machines of fire. So these have been occurring. These were occurring over Spokane. There's a bunch of them in Oregon right now. They're emerging in Texas and Nevada. And France had its first one ever in just a few weeks ago. And so what these systems do by puncturing the stratosphere is they control the whole air column of the lower atmosphere in their respective region. They gyre like hurricanes. They generate lightning, just like those massive fire clouds you see over volcanoes. And that lightning is live lightning that can start fires on tinder dry landscapes 20 to 30 miles outside the epicenter. So what that means is, you know, how I just finished a piece for New York Times, and we'll see if it comes out shortly, but talking about this idea of the singularity, which is, you know, the computer singularity is when the computer becomes smart enough to hijack the system and run itself. Well, that's what pyro CBs do. They hijack the atmosphere to perpetuate themselves, and nothing can stop them. And so that's where we're at right now. This is an all too familiar scene. This was a novelty back in 2016. This was a shocking sight that most of us had never beheld. Now we're seeing one of these a week. This is the intensity. This is trying to convey the intensity of what fires can do now. There were, you know, after Nagasaki and Hiroshima, there were nuclear shadows, these burn shadows of people and objects because the heat was so intense. This is a bicycle in Los Angeles. This is the remains of an F-150 in Fort McMurray. And this, you know, is another chimera being generated by modern 21st century fire. This is an EF3 fire tornado that was spawned by the Reading car fire, CARR fire in 2018. And so this was, you know, 165-mile horizontal winds, internal gas temperatures of 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. This is annihilating unsurvivable energy. And that's what modern fires can do now. This is another scene. Every car there was rolled. That high tension pylon in the back is 100 feet tall and made of steel. Two of those were ripped out of the ground. These cables, these carry 50,000 watts. You cannot lift them. I mean, obviously you shouldn't touch them, but these weren't live, but they are simply too heavy to lift. And the idea that a fireborne tornado could tear all of this out of the ground and heave it across the landscape, nobody's ready for this. These are cast iron pans. Cast iron pans are usually the only things to survive intense fires. Look what happened to these. This is a tractor seat. You know, this is energy beyond really what we can conceive. And you know, I'm probably running out of time here, but there are these trends. This is the Keeling curve of CO2, measuring excess CO2 in the atmosphere, anthropogenic CO2. Charles Keeling came out of Caltech in the 50s. That's where the baseline is, back in the late 50s at the bottom left there. And we see these various climate milestones, but CO2 continues rising. We're now at about 432 parts per million, well over 50% higher than pre-industrial times. Likewise, this is showing increases in global temperature, and that really it follows very precisely the rise in CO2. This is really interesting to look at. This is the past century of mega fires in the state of California. You can see 1930, 1970, 80, 1990s. There were occasional massive fires, 100,000, 200,000 acres. Look what happens after 2000. And behind the nameplate there, I don't know if you can see those, but the fires are so big they go off the charts, past 1 million acres, and there's so many of them we can't even keep track of them anymore on this bar graph made by Barry Saxifrage out of BC. To put this in perspective, the LA fires that killed 30 people and destroyed 16,000 structures, probably cost close to $250 billion all told, does not even make this chart. It was not big enough to make these charts. These are billion-dollar weather events in the United States. They follow exactly the Keeling curve, the megafire curve, and this interesting, just for what it's worth, is U.S. debt, which follows the same curve. Um, this is a kind of brutal truth that, we tell ourselves a lot of stories. We do a lot of negotiation with our consciences and our communities and our bankers and our constituents, but nature does not care. The laws of chemistry and physics trump everything. And while they're trumping everything, many of us are trying to take meaningful action. And most people understand that it's imperative that we reduce CO2. Predatory delay is another term coined by Alex Steffen, the futurist out of Berkeley. And he describes predatory delay as exactly what most governments are doing, what most fossil fuel companies are doing, and that is the deliberate slowing of change to prolong a profitable but unsustainable status quo whose costs will be paid by others. And um, so I'm going to get out of these slides. I'm going to stop the share. And there's just a very quick quote I wanted to read if I can. I'm just gonna paraphrase it. Basically, I did this piece for Time Magazine about the state of fire right now, and uh, just about out of time here. Basically, fossil fuels brought us where we are today, and in so many positive ways. We really owe our current lives to petroleum products, and they gave us the wealth, the mobility, the opportunities that we have. And so they've enriched us for the past 2 centuries. But what they are doing now is actively taking those gains away. Tens of thousands of evacuees, hundreds or thousands of houses, and billions of dollars at a time. And this is happening in real time. The gains that we've made on the back of fossil fuels are now being actively diminished and destroyed. There are experts here who can speak to that in a more technical way, but that's an overview. Thanks a lot for listening. And again, I'm really glad you're all here with us today.
All right. Pretty hard to follow John, but I'm going to do my best. You can see my slides, hopefully. So my name is Kelsey Winter. I'm the executive director of the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Center we call CIFC. It's a national not-for-profit that supports federal, provincial, and territorial wildfire agencies in everything from prevention and mitigation through to operations, training, incident command. I'm based on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen speaking people, which today are represented by the Songhe and the Esquimalt First Nation. So that places me in what is now known as Victoria, BC. So John really well just described a world in which fire itself is changing. Longer seasons, more extreme conditions, fire showing up in ways and in places that challenge what our systems were built for. So my piece of this conversation is, given that reality, what can we do about it? Because while we absolutely have to address the forces that are changing our climate, communities also need practical ways that they can live more safely with fire now. So I'm going to start and end with that distinction. We don't have a wildfire problem in the sense that wildfire itself is something we can eliminate. Fire belongs on many of our landscapes in Canada. It's always been here, and in many ecosystems across our great country, it's necessary. But what we do have is a wildfire reality, and one that, as John shared, is changing quickly. The conditions in which fires burn are changing. The consequences when fire reaches people are growing. So the goal can't be a fire-free Canada. It has to be communities and landscapes that can experience fire without every severe fire becoming a disaster. So that's the lens I'm going to use today. Wildfire is inevitable, but wildfire disaster is not. So the first thing, not just Canada's problem, and John shared that too. It's a real global resilience challenge across Australia, the US, Europe, Latin America. The details are different, but the questions that we're asking are increasingly familiar. So how do we manage landscapes under these changing conditions? And how do we protect communities that are built beside and sometimes within these fire-prone environments? And how do we maintain response capacity when multiple countries need help at the same time? At CIFC, we see that global connection very directly. So we move people and equipment across provincial and territorial boundaries to respond to fire every season. And in difficult years, which seems to be most of them now, we rely on our international partners. So in 2023, we had personnel from 12 countries across 6 continents. In 2025, more than 1,600 international firefighters supporting the country. And this year, again, we're relying on our global partners. So the system's valuable, but it does tell us something important, that we can't continue to assume that there will always be this unlimited surge capacity waiting somewhere else. As we see fire seasons overlap now across the globe and other countries facing their own extremes, wildfire as well extending far, far beyond forestry, an emergency management issue, a public health issue, an indigenous governance issue, and increasingly an economic resilience issue. So if fire isn't respecting our borders, we'd say neither can the solutions in wildfire management. So this is just a slide on the Canadian experience. Some of these numbers you'll probably be familiar with. 2023 really changed the conversation for us. Over 17 million hectares burned, by far the largest in our recorded history. CIFC spent a record of 120 days at National Preparedness Level 5, which is the point where demand for resources is at the highest. And if it would have been comforting to call 2023 an extraordinary year and move on, but then 2024 burnt over 5 million hectares, and Jasper was a really, really visible reminder that even communities that have strong emergency services and deep experience with fire can be so profoundly affected. 2025, over 8 million hectares, which made it the second worst season in Canada's history. That year, 85,000 people evacuated, more than 45,000 from First Nations communities. And now we're in 2026. The season's still unfolding as we speak, as Andrew shared some of the stats in the beginning for BC. I deliberately didn't put a final number on this slide. Obviously, we don't have one yet. And in some ways, it's not the whole point. The point is that 3 of the worst seasons in our recorded history, like the graph John showed earlier of Cal Fire, it's the same. They were in the past 4 years. So communities can't plan on this assumption that a bad fire season is something they'll have to survive once. We have extraordinary firefighters in this country and sophisticated agencies and a strong mutual aid system, but it's a system operating in a different environment than the one that we built it for. So I think we need to change the question. For a long time, much of the public conversation has centered on how do we fight bigger fires? Do we need more aircraft or more crews or better technology? And the answer to those questions is yes. Response capacity matters enormously. We need excellent firefighters and we need aircraft and incident management, but suppression, it's a last line of defense. So when the weather's extreme and fuels are receptive and several communities are threatened at the same time, there's limits to what even the best response can accomplish. We cannot put an air tanker beside every house, and we can't put a fire crew or a fire truck on every road. So instead of just asking, how do we fight bigger fires, we have to ask, how do we build communities that are more resilient to fires? And that's not an argument for less suppression. I think it's an argument for giving suppression a better chance. And that means recognizing that we're not going to be able to suppress our way out of a changing fire environment, and we have to do more before smoke's in the air. So the shift is to move more of our sustained attention and our investment and our policy focus left on the continuum. So we need all 5, prevention through to recovery. But as a Canadian society, we're very exceptionally good at paying attention once the fire is visible. But community resilience means paying attention, doing more before that point. So looking at reduction of preventable ignitions, land use planning that considers risk before a neighborhood is built, more room for prescribed fire and Indigenous-led cultural fire, practicing evacuations before you have minutes to make that decision. It also means to continuing to learn as we go. We know in Canada, different landscapes, different communities, they're going to need different combinations of these interventions. We can still learn a lot from our partners in Australia, in the US, who are facing similar challenges, and they can likewise learn from us, and all of us can learn from Indigenous communities that have been living with and managing fire on this planet for centuries. But we do know, with all that learning, we still do know enough now to act. We don't need to wait before we start reducing obvious vulnerability. And so one slide, just I think that's important to share. This is the Fire Smart program. It's useful. A majority of people that have signed onto the webinar, I see a lot of you are from BC, so hopefully you're familiar with the program. It is a Canadian program. It's useful because it takes a very large problem and shows us where people can actually have agency. So if 90% of homes damaged and destroyed by wildfire are ignited by embers, that's important. When we see in some of the pictures John showed that massive wildfire, the perfectly rational reaction is, well, what am I supposed to do about that? That's a tsunami of fire. You can't personally change the wind that afternoon, and you can't order an air tanker, and you can't change the global climate, but you can change what happens when embers arrive at your home and your neighborhood. So if you think about the leaves where they gather in your house during a windstorm, or where snow accumulates in those corners. Fire Smart starts right there, in a non-combustible zone, fire-resistant materials, managing vegetation, and then it scales up so neighborhoods are working together. I do want to be careful here. Individual action is not a substitute for government action. So telling someone, clean your gutters, but ignoring risky development patterns or landscape conditions, that's absurd. The point is that resilience needs to be layered. So homes and neighborhoods and communities and governments really reinforcing each other. If there's one slide, I'm almost at the end. One slide that I want people to take away would be this one. Everyone has a lever, but the levers are different. The federal government can provide sustained investment and coordination at that national level. Provinces and territories, some big levers there around land and fuel management, response capacity. Indigenous governments need to be treated as governments. Space and resources for Indigenous-led stewardship. There's really deep fire knowledge in this country that colonial systems have spent generations suppressing rather than learning from. Municipalities have an enormous influence through land use decisions. Builders, insurers, homeowners, and neighbors matter. We shared earlier, wildfire doesn't stop at those property or boundary lines. And the point is that not that everyone carries equal responsibility. Governments have powers and resources that individuals aren't going to have, but the point is that everyone has a sphere of influence, and resilience is really strongest when we connect those spheres. Last slide for me. For a long time, success in wildfire management has meant how quickly we can find a fire, how effectively we can fight it, and how many resources we can mobilize when those conditions become difficult. And those things matter. And I'm incredibly proud of the people in this country who do that work at CIFC and all across the federal, provincial, and territorial wildfire agencies. But in this warming world, we need another measure for success. So when the fire arrives, because eventually in many places it's going to, how ready was the community? Did the landscape give firefighters a chance? Could homes survive embers? Could people evacuate safely? And I think that's the shift that we need to talk about, not from government responsibility to individual responsibility, and not from response to prevention, like you can choose one or the other. It's that shift from firefighting alone to building a Canada that's capable of living with fire. And that means big policy decisions. That means sustained investment. Carbon emissions need to be part of the decision on whether we move fires into modified response. Defensible space has to be part of bylaws for communities. And some of it's simple, as groups of neighbors spending Saturday, reducing things that can ignite around their homes. And none of those are going to solve this on their own, but together, I really think it can change the outcome. So everything that I shared today is really about adapting to the wildfire reality that's here and building communities and landscapes that are more resilient to the fire we know is coming. But I think adaptation is really only half of the equation. If the conditions that are driving more extreme fire continue to intensify, then the challenges that we're adapting to will just keep getting harder. So that takes us to Carly's piece of the conversation and that relationship between fire and carbon and fossil fuels and this warming climate. So I'll just leave you with, let's do two things at once, build resilience to the fire climate we have, but continue to work to avoid the fire climate that we don't want. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carly Phillips. I'm a senior research scientist at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I work with the Science Hub for Climate Litigation. Today, I'm going to be talking about protecting our communities from a different direction, and I'm going to be talking about the way that scientific research is being used to hold fossil fuel companies accountable, and with a particular focus on a study that I was part of published in 2023, led by Christy Dahl, that traced emissions from the largest fossil fuel producers and cement manufacturers to burned area in Western North America. The science is really clear. The combustion of fossil fuels is the main driver of climate change, but we can't truly address climate change without addressing the role of the fossil fuel industry. We know that for decades, they furthered the problem, deceived the public, and obstructed climate action, all while ensuring that opting out of using their products remained as difficult as possible. And so to start, I'd like to talk about the actual emissions coming from these entities, as well as their knowledge about climate change and its impacts. So what you're seeing in this graph is gigatons of carbon dioxide emitted per year. And on the x-axis, you're looking at time. So it's showing how carbon emissions from fossil fuel companies and cement manufacturing have grown since the Industrial Revolution. Like John mentioned, there have been massive advances in quality of life as a result of fossil fuels. It's during this time that we invented cars and buses that rely on fossil fuels. We started heating our homes and workplaces by burning fossil fuels. So, given that, it's not surprising that the emissions from fossil fuels have increased during that time. But what is surprising, however, is that the fossil fuel industry has continued to grow despite decades of internal knowledge about what the consequences of burning fossil fuels and continuing to burn them would be. And so I'd like to show you a couple of those here so we can see how, despite industry knowledge internally that their own scientists were producing, they continued to ramp up production of fossil fuels. So in the 1950s, there was a growing awareness, which you can see here with the circle, that fossil fuel emissions were going to lead to temperature increases. By 1965, we're at a turning point because the American Petroleum Institute, which is the largest US oil and gas industry trade association and lobbying group, had internal documents that showed a connection between fossil fuel products and global warming. This was presented at the organization's annual meeting in 1965. Next, in 1980, we know that ExxonMobil, one of the largest fossil fuel companies in the world, produced internal modeling showing that carbon dioxide and temperature were going to lead to global warming. And looking back on those projections, they were remarkably accurate in terms of where we are right now. In 1989 and 1990, many fossil fuel companies and their trade groups formed the Global Climate Coalition to oppose mandatory reductions in emissions by obscuring scientific information about the role of fossil fuels on climate change, and began a deceptive messaging campaign focused on doubt and uncertainty. In the 2010s and in the 2000s and 2010s, they continued to ratchet up their deception and disinformation campaigns, including broad use of advertorials, which are advertisements that are disguised as editorials, which were published in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, which oversold the impact of certain technologies like biofuels from algae while continuing to ramp up fossil fuel production. And this remains the case in the 2020s. The fossil fuel companies have continued to make misleading or outright false claims, particularly as it relates to net zero. And so who are these carbon majors? That's what I'll be calling them through the rest of this presentation. They are the largest fossil fuel producers and cement manufacturers that include investor-owned companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron, as well as state-owned entities like Saudi Aramco and nation states themselves, like the National Iranian Oil Company. And you can see their proportion of global fossil fuel and cement emissions in the far column here on your screen. And so the role of these fossil fuel companies and the outsized role they played both in producing emissions and also in deceiving the public and making sure that climate action didn't happen is what led us to the research question that guided the study I'm going to be talking about, which is how much of the increase in wildfire activity in Western North America is attributable to emissions from these carbon majors. And that brings us to attribution science, which in broad strokes identifies and quantifies human contributions to climate change and related impacts. Attribution science is important because it allows us to make a causal link by modeling a world with climate change and a world without climate change, therefore allowing us to isolate the contribution of climate change to a trend or an extreme event. In the case of the research that I'm going to be talking about today, we focused on source attribution, where we isolated the contribution of the carbon majors, the emissions that can be traced to them since the Industrial Revolution. We linked that to changes in global mean temperature, which has a relationship with vapor pressure deficit, which I'll talk about in a second, but essentially is a measure of how the atmosphere can draw moisture out of our systems, out of our forests, out of other ecosystems that dries them out and really primes them for fire. And then we were able to link vapor pressure deficit to burned area. And as a result, through that causal chain, we were able to show the connection between emissions from the carbon majors and burned area in our ecosystems. A quick note on vapor pressure deficit. This graphic is going to explain what vapor pressure deficit is, because I know that's a really wonky scientific term. So vapor pressure deficit's the difference between the amount of moisture in the air and the amount of moisture that the air could hold based on its temperature. So you can see in these bubbles here, if each of these smaller bubbles is water vapor molecules, you can see that warmer air holds more water vapor than cooler air. If we go to the bubbles that are labeled ambient, you can see that at 50% relative humidity, which is both of those images there, you can see that the warmer air could hold more moisture and as a result has a larger vapor pressure deficit, which you can see in that deficit column on the far right. And what this shows is, again, the drying power of the atmosphere. It corresponds to the ability of the atmosphere to draw moisture out of these systems, drying them out and priming them to burn. And there's a clear relationship between vapor pressure deficit from March to September, which you can see on the x-axis of this figure, as well as total burned area during a fire season, which you can see on the y-axis. And you can see that tight relationship, which is what allowed us to understand the relationship between emissions from these carbon majors and burned area. This is the study area here that you can see in green in the map. You can see that it's focused on Western North America, particularly looking at forested area, and is primarily in the United States, but also in southwestern Canada. And what we found was pretty striking. We found that for all the burned, for the fire-prone conditions that we're seeing, the increase in vapor pressure deficit, we saw a near 50% increase in vapor pressure deficit, which corresponds to fire danger since 1901, that's attributable to those emissions. So a 50% increase in fire danger is attributable to the emissions of the largest fossil fuel companies and cement manufacturers. And you can see that illustrated in this figure here, where you can see vapor pressure deficit modeled with the largest 88 carbon producers and without in the white versus pink. So their emissions led to a substantial increase in the drying power of the atmosphere. And when we looked at how this translated into burned area, we were surprised to find that 37% of forest burned area since 1986, roughly 19 million acres, was attributable to their emissions. Research in the attribution field has also been used to show that climate change increased the likelihood of the large burned area and simultaneous extreme fire weather during Canada's record smashing 2023 wildfire season, as well as the extreme wildfire season of 2017 and 2018. And this is a powerful tool when we're thinking about accountability, both for fossil fuel companies and also for other entities that are high emitters and major polluters. And we can see the way that evidence like this can support cases in the number of cases that have been filed across the world. So this is a figure that shows the number of cases that have been filed on the y-axis and over time on the x. This kind of research can be used to inform climate litigation because it provides a causal link between climate change and specific impacts, as well as specific emitters and impacts. And the focus of some of these accountability focused lawsuits is for fossil fuel producers, but others focus on holding governments accountable because there are many ways to divide and understand emissions. And so I want to show some country emissions too to help contextualize the primary major emitters that we're seeing globally. And so if we look at country emissions, this is current annual emissions. This figure is from the Global Carbon Project and highlights annual emissions as of 2024, the most recent data set that's available. And you can see that China, the United States, and India are the top three, but that Canada emits the 11th most emissions annually of all the countries in the world. And if we look at this cumulatively, the results are even more striking. So since the Industrial Revolution, we can see that the United States is the largest emitter, followed by the European Union, China, the UK, India, and that Canada as a nation has the sixth most cumulative emissions of all countries in the world. And that doesn't include exported emissions for products that go abroad. And so holding fossil fuel producers accountable for climate change, understanding how our leaders and policies are shaping our national emissions is important. But in addition to those two pieces, understanding the way that climate change is driving even more emissions is also critical and part of what complicates this entire conversation that we're having today, which brings us back to wildfire, because wildfires can emit a huge amount of carbon to the atmosphere. And if we're thinking about the 2023 wildfire season in Canada, you can see here the red column. This is looking at carbon emissions in 2023. And you can see that the 2023 Canadian fires released more carbon than almost every other country in the world, with the exception of China, the US, and India. And what this really brings home for me is that in addition to holding fossil fuel companies accountable through the courts, we also need to phase out fossil fuels because that's the only way that we're going to be able to reduce the impacts of climate change in the long term and hold these companies accountable for their contributions, not only for the contributions of their emissions, but also for the deception, delay, and obstruction that they exhibited while creating those emissions. And so I'll end there so we have time for questions. If you want to reach out, my contact information is available there.
Thank you, Carly. Thank you to all of our panelists. One of the downsides to a webinar format is that I think this is where I'd encourage you all to give a round of applause, but we can't do that easily on a webinar. So I appreciate all of the information. We've been joined over the course of the webinar by over 400 people. So there's clearly great interest in this topic. And we'll turn in a moment to your questions. Firstly, I'd like to briefly add that our work at West Coast Environmental Law with the Subig Oil Campaign emphasizes that our communities cannot afford the costs that climate change is imposing on us, both through wildfires, but also in so many other ways. And we desperately need a real and public conversation about how we're going to pay for these costs, how we're going to keep our communities safe, and ultimately the reality that we need oil, gas, and coal industries to pay their fair share, both so that we can afford to keep our communities safe, but also so that business decisions that they make and that governments make on the basis of their balance sheets reflect the true costs of their products. As such, and building on the science and law that Carly has shared with us in the context of the panelists as a whole have shared, we're asking BC's local governments to bring a class action lawsuit against global fossil fuel companies to recover a fair share of the climate costs experienced in BC. We can hold global fossil fuel companies responsible for the harm that they've caused in BC without new laws from the federal or provincial governments. We need to use it's never been legal to sell a product you know is going to destroy communities. We need to hold this industry accountable. If you haven't signed the Climate Cost Recovery Declaration, we'd invite you to take a moment to go to subigoil.ca and do so. But let's now turn to the questions that you've been asking in the Q&A function. We got a lot of questions. We're not going to have time to go through all of them, I'm afraid, but please do upvote them. Like press the thumbs up symbol next to a question if you think it should be asked, and we'll get to the ones that we can get to. First, we have a question from Max. Are emergency response professionals starting to speak out about the need for sufficient, i.e., radical climate action? Why or why not? And how can we support them to do so more?
Well, I'll jump in really quick on that. I've given a couple of keynotes at firefighter conferences, so fire chiefs nationally and provincially, and it's a real honor to get to speak to those folks. They're certainly on the front lines of climate change. Most of them, as you know, veterans have seen fire behavior change in their careers for the worse. And I think as public servants, and especially in a where climate has become a political football, uh, they're loath to wade in because they really need the public's trust and they need to be able to trust each other. Their lives literally depend on it. So we haven't heard much in Canada, though that may be changing in part to some conversations I've been having. I'm hopeful, and it's their business, not mine, so I can't comment on it. But I can say that in Australia and in the UK, fire officials are connecting the dots between fire danger and climate change and recognizing the need for action. I'll stop there.
And I'll just add too, I think there's a bit of a distinction between emergency professionals speaking about climate change versus advocating, like you say, John, for specific climate policies. I think from a wildfire perspective in Canada, it's becoming impossible to talk about fire and not talk about climate change because we are experiencing the operational consequences, right? The more extreme fire behavior and the impacts on communities and that competition for resources. But I think if we give space to emergency professionals to talk about their experiences and where they're credible, talking about what they're observing and the limits to emergency response, I think that's the space that we can support them to do it more. I mean, they know that we can't keep just adding firefighters and aircraft and equipment, and expect to be able for that to compensate for this increasingly hazardous environment. So they're powerful voices, I think, and if you focus on the consequences of inaction, that's what they see, right? So if they can speak to what they see and we can give space for that, I think that's we're seeing more and more of that now.
All right, thank you. We had a question emailed in asking whether about David Suzuki's statements that it's too late to fight global warming. The question that the person asked is it too late? Is David Suzuki correct?
I can take a first stab at that question. I completely understand where David Suzuki is coming from and appreciate his perspective and the long-term view that he has on this. But I don't think it is too late. And I think that framing and that mindset really only benefits the powerful interests who want to keep us entrenched in a fossil fuel-based economy. And I think there are things that we can do, like phase out fossil fuels, like you said, Andrew, to file lawsuits against these major oil corporations to hold them accountable for the costs that communities around the world are now facing. And I think there are things that we can save by reducing fossil fuel emissions and phasing out fossil fuels. Right? We know that from reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius increase, all of our coral reefs are likely to be lost. But we are just approaching 1.5 right now. And so we still have time to save some of our coral reefs should we act quickly. And so there are loads of examples like that of things that we can retain and save if we take action with urgency.
I think we also have to note nature's capacity for rebounding. And two examples, one during the Summer Olympics in Beijing, they wanted to have a marathon, of course, and Beijing's air, especially back then in 2012, I think it was horrible. And so they banned cars for the couple of weeks prior to the Olympics, and the runners ran under blue skies. And that's how quickly they changed the atmosphere over one of the biggest cities in the world. Likewise, during COVID, CO2 emissions globally plummeted. And nobody wants to stop traveling because we're sick and terrified of dying. But if we do stop emitting CO2 and methane, the it's measurable in real time, just as the increases are measurable in real time. And so we have enormous agency. And the Montreal Protocol, in which we reduce CHFCs, the chlorofluorocarbons that were eating away at the ozone hole. That didn't solve everything, but it showed this capacity for international unity that produces a measurable result in real human time. And that's what we have extraordinary agency as Homo sapiens more than any other species. And already, I'll stop with this. China, the world's biggest emitter, is bending the curve on its emissions. Right now, it's developed so much solar and so much wind power, it's actually starting to offset its emissions from petroleum and coal. And so it's bending the curve. I think India is pretty close behind. Most European countries have bent the curve already. So real progress is being made, not fast enough for most of us, and not fast enough to stop some pretty devastating changes, but certainly fast enough is for meaningful impacts.
I'd only add a little bit of a reframing. I mean, it's not too late, but it is late, and I think it's important to make that distinction, and it makes what we do now more important rather than less important. I think from a wildfire perspective, we know conditions have changed and we're facing the consequences, and some level of adaptation is unavoidable, but every fraction of a degree of warming that we avoid matters. And I think there's hope in that it does matter. And we're seeing more countries step in wildfire to share resources, and we're seeing people focus on resiliency, and more people understand that they have a role to play. And I think that changes how we think about living with fire. So not too late, but for sure late.
All right. Thank you all. We have a question from Holly, a freelance journalist, who would love to hear your thoughts on what journalists are generally missing and what we should be focusing on or focusing on more effectively. What are some specific solutions focused stories that deserve more attention?
Can I maybe do this one first? Is that okay? I think if I'm speaking from the wildfire space, we cover wildfire so well as an emergency, but not enough as a year-round public policy land management challenge. We have this window of opportunity after a catastrophic fire event where the public is listening about fire and the things that need to change. And then that peters off, and we don't hear about fire again until it comes back around into fire season. And I think those really interesting solutions that are getting missed are in those in-betweens, like stories of Indigenous-led fire stewardship and examples of new technology or improvements in workforce capacity. And those are the things that happen after those catastrophic events. And I think that, more stories on not how do we stop fire, but, what are we doing differently before the next one? I think that's what I would share.
I got a couple to add to that. One would be just words to Google as a journalist: permaculture. And then I think it's basin and swale. It's a mode of water retention that anybody can do. It's basically what beavers do, but humans can do it too. And then And then the third would be regrarian. And just Google those words and see what you come up with. And there's a whole global population of people who are working to restore destroyed landscapes and also if you really want to brighten your day, watch The Biggest Little Farm. It's a documentary film. It used to be on Netflix. I don't know if it still is. It's called The Biggest Little Farm. I believe that's the right title. And it's just about an amazing land restoration project. And that is going to go a long way to mitigating fire, but also creating a future that we all want to live in and share with our kids.
If I can add one more that addresses not the solutions focused story, but what journalists are missing and what they can cover more effectively. And I think it's the way that the fossil fuel industry is interconnected and intertwined with our government agencies and our elected officials, because that completely disincentivizes not allowing future fossil fuel projects and disincentivizes reducing fossil fuel use generally and any measure of accountability. I can speak to, as someone who lives in the US context a bit more specifically, but we know that the fossil fuel industry is doing everything that it can right now to fight the lawsuits that are currently targeting them. They are doing public record requests for scientists who are involved in the type of science that I just shared. We have a current fossil fuel executive as the Department of Energy chair, that's not what it's called, secretary in the US, Chris Wright, right? There's been this infiltration of fossil fuel money and fossil fuel interests into our government. And I think that there's not enough attention to that to that and to the way that that connects to the broader deception and disinformation campaign that got them to the place to be able to be there.
And that same impact is felt in Canada too. And we were colonized by the British and colonized for a time by the French and have been somewhat colonized by the United States. But Canada's also been colonized by the petroleum industry, and it's calling way too many and much of the tunes being played right now. And when you look at the full court press into natural gas development, pipelines, and bitumen development in Fort McMurray. We're going backwards, and that is lobbyists connecting the dots between fossil fuel lobby and Ottawa and Washington D.C. and other capitals. So I really want to declare my solidarity with Carly there.
All right, we have a couple of minutes before the hour. I do know that Carly and Kelsey both need to leave on the hour. I can throw one more question and let them go first, and then John can maybe answer because he can stay for a few minutes longer. What do you think of the timber industry's Forestry as a Solution marketing campaign to present the industry as wildfire saviors of BC? What role has industrial logging played in making BC forests more flammable, and what role could forestry workers play in reducing wildfire risk?
That's a really big question for 2 minutes at the very end of a webinar. And I think that we all play a role. I mean, I had a slide in this is going to be a bit of a cop out of an answer because we don't have that long, but we all have a sphere of influence to play. Adaptive forest management has a role. Forest industry has a role. Changing how we adapt our landscapes has a role. And I think that we're looking for that delta, right? That perfect triangle between what we can do on the landscape and what we can do in the built environment and how we can reduce emissions and slow down what's happening with our climate. And that's something we're all going to have to participate in a little bit differently than we have historically, regardless of what badge we wear on our uniform.
All right. Carly, assuming you're not unmuting, so I'm guessing you don't have anything specifically to add there. Thank you
Nothing
very
to add to
much,
what
Carly,
Kelsey
and
said.
very much both of you for joining us. I'll release you back to your busy days, and I invite John maybe to stay on and answer a couple of questions if people want to stay a little longer. A couple more, yeah, more questions. We so appreciate your participating in this.
Thanks,
Thanks so
everybody.
much. Thanks to everybody for joining.
I've got a couple of comments on that forestry question. It sounds sort of self-serving and somewhat bogus to me. A lot of monocropping of trees, whether it's Douglas fir or Scotch pine or Christmas trees, those are not ecosystems. Those are farms, and they are prone to disease, and they burn down like a son of a gun. And that's part of what is burning down the Garonne area of Western France right now are these restored, human restored pine forests that are basically tree farms, and they burn like crazy. And the forest industry is there to make money from growing and cutting trees down. And what we really need is to restore the actual forest system, which is a much more complicated entity and is a much harder one for the industries to profit from in the way that they are set up right now. So, and the very sad fact about the state of Canadian forests is they have become, in the past 20 years, rather than carbon sinks absorbing carbon, um, they have become net carbon emitters because so many of them have died due to beetle kill, partly because of warming winters, and so many of them have burned. So I don't believe the forest industry, as it's currently structured, can reverse that.
Okay, we're past the hour. I of two minds because we have 47 open questions. We are not going to get through those, folks. I think probably the fairest thing to do rather than keeping people and it's on is to thank you all for attending. You will be receiving a survey when you close this webinar and in an email. There have been a lot of questions about sharing the recording. Yes, we will be sharing the recording. And we look forward to engaging with you, all of the participants in any way that you are interested in engaging in this conversation, which will continue. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.